Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Now, my guest today is Peter Herford, who is a longtime journalist with CBS. Peter had a grandstand seat during major events that happened in American journalism. He was there throughout the entire Vietnam War. He saw and witnessed the John F. Kennedy assassination. He worked alongside Walter Cronkite. He can tell you all the amazing things that happened in American journalism throughout the what we would consider to be the modern history of America. And yet he would also say that today is the golden age of journalism. If you want to know why, this series is going to show you. So push that subscribe button. Join me as just an ordinary optimistic American listening to one of the greats in American journalism. Let's get on with this show. Well, Peter, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you. Thanks so much for going on the Optimistic American show.
My pleasure. I look forward to it. You don't often get to do optimistic stories when you're dealing with journalists.
I understand that. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that, how sometimes it's the job of the journalist to be the critic and the pessimist. But on our show, part of what we've tried to focus on is what's right about America, what's going right with America. And I love some of the comments that I've heard from you and other places, which is journalism isn't as bad today as you think. In fact, maybe this is the golden age of journalism. And we're going to talk more about that. But before we do, I want to give people a better understanding of Peter Herford and understanding like who you are. So let's just go to the very beginning. You and your family came from Germany. Tell me what year that was, how old you were, and why you guys actually moved here.
Born in 1936, that is, and came to the United States in September of 39, which if people know their history, it could not have been a moment later. That's when World War II broke out, and came to New York. And life took off for the third time for my parents because they had lived through World War I. They had lived through the Great German Depression. And here we go, World War II. So that by the time they got to the United States, they were in their 40s and they had been through incredible experiences that nobody should have to go through.
What made them leave? What was the reason for leaving? Was it the oncoming World War II? They could see it?
Very simple. My father was Jewish. My mother wasn't, which by strict Jewish standards does not make me Jewish, but I am. And that was enough. My father actually had to be smuggled out of Germany a year before we went out. He was a musician, and he wouldn't believe the severity of what was going to happen. All of his friends had left, said, "Get the hell out of here." And he wouldn't listen, so he got smuggled out of the country, thank God. And then we followed a year later.
So you go to work in CBS in New York. Tell me the story about how you end up in CBS. I thought it was an interesting story how you got started.
It's an absolutely wild set of circumstances. I have been one of the luckiest people in the world in terms of stepping into the right pool of water instead of the wrong pool of water. My career started again by accident in Anchorage, Alaska, because I was escaping my parents after schooling. And I was working for a TV station there. I was hired to be an announcer, of all things. And it happened by accident. Our news department, which was one person, quit. Boss came to me, said, "Would you like to do news?" That's how my career started. I said yes. And there, the next 60 years were taken care of. While I was there, year before statehood, the year of statehood, and the year after statehood, which of course as a kid I thought, oh, that's normal. Well, it isn't, as anybody rightly knows. A letter comes from CBS offering a CBS fellowship. CBS had a foundation in those days, and they had a mid-career fellowship for people from their news departments. And I thought, what's to lose? I'll give it a try. I got it. And so off I go to New York. Oddly enough, back to Columbia, where I had spent 6 years between undergraduate and graduate school. I was in my 7th year. And when I got done with that, I'd had 3 years in Alaska, and I told my people there, technically they can't hire me, but frankly, I've done what I can in Alaska. I'm going to give it a shot. And I went to my future bosses in New York, and I said, okay, I understand you're not supposed to hire me, but I'm interested, obviously, at my age and my experience. And if you don't hire me, I'm going to get a hack license and park in front of this building until you do hire me. Well, that didn't do it, but they did hire me. And that's how the career got started. Again, a total fluke, but you have to remember what television news was like in those days. In New York, WCBS, the home station, and the network were together. You worked in the same newsroom. You know, we sort of palmed off one on the other. While I was there in the first 3 months, they came to us and they said, okay, you've got a choice. You can keep working for WCBS or you can come to the network. Most people kept going for WCBS because nobody had, network news was 15 minutes once a day and very few television sets. So the challenge really was to look forward. I made a lucky decision. I said, I'll go with the network, and that's how the career got launched.
All right. So help us out historically understanding this. Edward Murrow was there before you came in. In fact, I think he was leaving right at the time you were coming into the national network.
Exactly.
What influence did Edward Murrow have on news? How did things begin to change during the period of time that he was there?
It had no influence on television news because he and his generation looked at television news as a mistake at best. They were radio people. And most of them in his generation, he not included, came out of the written press. So that, you know, their God was the printed word and everything that went into training a written journalist. Murrow had the wisdom and the luck of being able to pick those people off during World War II when radio really came into its own because it was the way you found out what was going on. And as a result, he became the leader of a remarkable group of people whom, in a sense, I inherited when I went to CBS News. They were all people who were, you know, standing on the top of the mountain from my point of view when I was in my 20s. Yeah. No, so his influence was enormous, but not in television. Never was. I should take that back. I mean, See It Now was an iconic documentary series, and certainly that had a huge influence. But in day-to-day journalism, no, not at all.
So during the time you were there during the, I suspect, during the period of time when the debates happened with John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon.
Yep.
You were also there
Yep.
during the Kennedy assassination. Did those things play a transformational role in how television versus radio or print news was looked at?
Totally. In every conceivable way. Television news was embryonic. We had just started the half-hour news broadcast a year before Kennedy was assassinated. And again, there were less than 50% of American homes had TV sets. TV news, when we went from 15 minutes to 30 minutes, the big issue was, how are you ever going to fill 30 minutes of news? And we see what's happened since with the development of cable, 24-hour news, and so forth. So the Kennedy assassination comes along, and talk about blindsiding us. We were in no way prepared for that to happen. But we had to deal with it because it was the overwhelming news story. A little story about that, which is illustrative, was
Actually, tell us the whole
Don Hewitt.
story. I'd like to hear the whole
Oh, the
story of
whole
this,
story.
of the
Okay.
Kennedy assassination and what happened during that day.
Well, it normal began as a normal day. Lunchtime, people in New York were taking breaks. I was one of those. I was a writer for Walter Cronkite. I was one of those who was left behind. Don Hewitt, a name some people may know, he was then the director and the executive producer of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. He was also the man who invented 60 Minutes and turned it into what it was. He was around, and I got a phone call at my desk, and it was Dr. Frank Stanton, who was the president of CBS. And he wanted to talk to Don Hewitt. So I took the phone, put it at Don's face, and I said, "It's Dr. Stanton." Don took the phone. Don, to anybody who knew him as a genius who had 10 ideas a minute, 8 of which were pretty good. And he was a talker. I mean, nobody else talked when he talked. And he was dead silent for about a minute, minute and a half. Put the phone down. I looked at him and said, "Don, what did he say? What did he say? What did he say?" He said, "You can take the network anytime you want, and you can keep it for as long as you want." That was the beginning. When the bulletin happened that confirmed the death of President Kennedy, we took air, and we did not leave air for 4.5 days. Now, this was an organization that was in no way prepared to spend 4.5 days telling people what was going on in the world. God bless Walter. He was there, had a background that permitted him to do long special events covering news events. So, yes, it was a challenge for him, but not a challenge he wasn't prepared for. Technologically, we were terribly ill-equipped. Anybody who's been in an old-fashioned television studio with huge cameras, that's what we had. That's what we had to work with. Our portable cameras were film cameras, which meant what? You took the film, you had to process it, you had to edit it, you had to write scripts, on and on and on. It wasn't the kind of thing you have today where, you reach in your pocket, you take out your iPhone, and you're on the air. And on the side, you can make a film or an advertisement or anything else you want. So that technologically, we were in the dark ages. In terms of the audience came to us in numbers that nobody had ever seen before. If anybody is around who remembers that time, they probably remember if they didn't have a TV set, they found somebody who did and camped out and started watching. And if you had a TV set, open your home to others because they're going to come in and want to watch what's going on. And for 4.5 days, because if you stop to think of it, the actual news after he is killed is not that rich. Yes, there was the Oswald situation and so forth, but those things go by blindingly fast. The rest of the time, we had to do what news people recognize, fill airtime. Well, we were able remarkably enough to fill it with an extraordinary amount of news. Why? This was a worldwide event. That's the other thing that happened. The world was coming to television. And although we did not have satellites and we did not have a lot of the modern tools, everybody in the world was tuned to whatever they could tune to find out what the hell was going on in the United States, because Jack Kennedy had become an icon. He was one of the most incredibly popular people that ever was in the White House, so that his name was known worldwide, he was admired worldwide, on and on and on and on. So the attention that was focused on this event was like nothing that had ever happened before. Now it ends finally, 4.5 days later. What happens? All of the people who were watching television in the United States, the overwhelming numbers, because nothing else was on, that's all you had to watch, they expected the kind of coverage that they had just seen. So all of a sudden, this huge pressure on an industry that was totally unprepared for it to deliver the kind of instant information that happened during those 4.5 days. So it revolutionized everything about television. It put television news to the fore. All of a sudden, it became the most important medium in the United States and eventually in the world. It was the thing that drew audiences to television, was the ability to see things that may not have happened immediately, but within minutes of the time it did, or hours.
So you also worked alongside Walter Cronkite, and he also was an icon in American journalism and politics. Can you tell me about Walter himself?
Yeah, that was the world's most common question for anybody from CBS. Tell us what Walter is really like. And it was the easiest answer you could possibly give. He is exactly the person you see. Walter happened to have a skill, and his skill came from being in local news in Washington. He was hired to anchor the local news in Washington at the CBS affiliate station. And the skill that he had, in those days, teleprompters were embryonic. And he hated the idea of trying to read something in front of a screen in front of him. He ad-libbed the news.
Wow.
He had, whether he had a photographic memory or not, you can debate, but it was close. He would read in all day long. He absorbed a tremendous amount of information. And then he was able to broadcast it in a fluent style that people absolutely wondered at, because they knew everybody else was reading something off a teleprompter. And here was this guy in a very normal voice putting it out there. That's how the network came to hire him, because nobody else had that kind of skill. So that he had that skill to work with. He happened to have a very, very broadcast voice. It was a wonderfully fluent voice with a rather neutral, no accent at all, so neutral. And he was a presence. You know, he looked like what came to be known as the anchorman. And, you know, what happened with Walter? Walter, for I forget how many years now, was considered the most trusted man in America. Now, when you stop to think of where journalism is now, where I pity them, where anchors are now, what do they carry? They carry a huge weight on their shoulders. They're distrusted, they're vilified, they're people angry at them, all this kind of thing. And here was Walter, the most trusted man in America, which meant more so than the President of the United States. Walter had better numbers than the President of the United States, even among his supporters. So that he wasn't, the question is good, what was Walter really like? Because he was unreal. And people couldn't believe anybody could be like that. One of the best stories I know about him in terms of answering that question was, those of us who worked with him never knew what his politics were. We kicked that one around amongst each other. You know, we looked for little signs, and you know, one side would say, you know, he's really a rock solid Republican conservative, and others would say, no, I don't think so. Maybe he's this way, maybe he's that way. We didn't find out until after he left CBS that he was a raving liberal and had been all along, and was able to mask it completely. That was a real skill for a man like that. He had been approached at various times by both political parties to run for office. The Republicans in New York State virtually handed him an open seat in the U.S. Senate, and he wisely said, no, thank you. My job is this, your job is that, and the two don't mix. But that's how trusted he was and how ill-defined he was as an individual. And having spent years working with him, he was an enormously comfortable man within himself. He had no strange oddities about him, no bad habits. He was not a womanizer. He was not a lot of the things that famous people get to be when they don't have really control of who they are and that they live up to the image that they present to the public.
When I think of Walter Cronkite, we named a school here after him, the Cronkite School at ASU. I think of this person who was extremely balanced, fair to both sides, presented the news, and allowed us to decide. But there were a couple of exceptions that stood out to me. One of them was during the Kennedy period where he cried. I guess had tears would be a more appropriate way of saying it, and then went back to reporting the news. But it was one of those moments where you left this unbiased scene and moved to this great emotional tear going on inside the United States. How was that seen inside the newsroom when that happened?
It was very easy to accommodate and very easy to deal with. If anybody likes, that piece of video is all over the place. You can find it on the internet. Do your search and you'll find that video. It's a moment. He takes off his glasses and you can see that there are tears in his eyes and he hesitates. And for a man who is accustomed to a fluid style of delivery, no matter what's going on, that was the mark as much as the tears that something dramatic had happened. And I can only say that the few seconds that it took were as natural an expression of what everybody was feeling that nobody made a big deal about it. We had people in the office who were crying for days. We had people breaking down. We had people not capable of working in those circumstances. We had every level of emotional reaction you can possibly imagine. No cheers. And here was a man who, for a very small moment, in effect, expressed what we were all feeling. So that wasn't hard to deal with. It really wasn't hard to deal with. Your point about his balance and being fair and so forth and so on, a lot of that had to do with the culture at CBS News. A man whose name nobody knows, Dick Salant, who was the president of CBS News, if you can believe it, for 17 years, and was a protege indeed of Frank Stanton's. When he came aboard, all we knew about him was he'd been a lawyer. And we all said, oh, God forbid, a lawyer is going to run a news operation. We're all in trouble. Well, I can tell you a year and a half later, we all would have died for him. He turned out to be our protector in so many ways. He turned out to be the bulwark against the commercial pressures of television. He was a visionary in terms of what he was able to bring to CBS News. And he set standards. One of the things he did, and I was involved with that project, he said, we don't have any written standards at CBS News. So he said, we should have that. We spent 2 years, and not just a few individuals. We interviewed people. We went all over the lot with this. And we produced a set of standards by which CBS News would operate. And this dealt with issues like fairness and balance. It dealt with how we conducted ourselves in interviews and with the general public, all this kind of thing. Wisely enough, and you'll recognize this in terms of news, it was a loose leaf binder because standards shift and change. And if you try and write a Bible that is rock solid and will not change, it doesn't work in the news business. News business changes as much as the news does. So this was a loose leaf binder of standards that were followed, and NBC followed them, ABC followed them. They modified them to meet their own requirements, all that kind of thing. But it was an era where that was possible. Today, there are standards. If you go to the New York Times, the Washington Post, various others, there are standards that you can see written down, but you know exactly what they are because they have a long history. And that's how you live. The news business in general, which we can talk about later, standards have sort of flown out the window and never come back. Richard Salant was a godsend to CBS News on a variety of levels, despite the fact that he was a lawyer, which absolutely frightened us when he was first appointed. In his 17 years, he is probably the easiest answer to the question people ask of where did the glory days of CBS News come from? And he was the man who set the standards, set the platform on which we operated, made the key decisions in hiring and rarely, but it did happen, firing. And he represented what I think meant all of us who worked for CBS News at that time would agree were the glory days, were the best days of CBS News.
Right. So help us understand where CBS was at that time. My understanding is, I don't know if this is an actual correct statistic, that the audience of CBS was actually larger than the audience of all three major networks today, CNN, Fox News, as well as MSNBC. But it was a major portion of the United States and world market share.
The only place that that's true is 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes, the most popular television program of all time, was the only one that had an audience that was bigger than everybody else put together. The CBS Evening News was competitive with the NBC News, was competitive with ABC News, although ABC News was a late starter in that game. We were all within a point or two of each other. That shifted with people's tastes and so forth. Yes, we had the longest run at number one, but number one was not a runaway number one when it came to nightly news. The only place that was true was with 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes is a story unto itself, an extraordinary story unto itself.
Tell me that story, at least the short version of it.
The short version of it is that CBS, as a television network, had a major problem. It was called Disney on Sunday nights. Disney on Sunday nights was owned by the kids at home. The wonderful world of Disney owned the audience the way eventually 60 Minutes owned the audience. It had a larger audience than anybody else. It was the number one program, yada, yada, yada. Well, ABC and CBS tried desperately throwing everything they possibly could at it. They tried movies, they tried series, nothing worked. Disney owned the time slot. So finally, CBS corporate came to CBS News and said, listen, we own that time slot, put something into it. And that opened the door to Don Hewitt, who was the inventor and executive producer of the broadcast, for an idea that, frankly, he got from the BBC. BBC had a nightly news program, 5 nights a week, that surveyed the day's news, but in an open format that permitted them to have all the time that they needed, because it was the last program on the air that night. So he developed the concept. He said we'd never be able to do that in commercial television in the US. He said we could do an hour a week and do highly produced but longer news stories of all different kinds, because Don recognized instinctively the audience will follow a star, as they had followed Walter Cronkite. And we had a number of them. A guy by the name of Mike Wallace, eventually Morley Safer. Others who came along who were draws themselves. People would tune in to watch what they were doing. So he developed a format where we had 3 pieces. They weren't necessarily news pieces. Maybe 2 out of the 3 were news pieces, and the third was a feature piece. And he had the genius of balancing the 3 after building a library of them, because some stories you have to put on immediately, other stories can be put on much later. He would make a marvelous mix of 3 stories that, as he said, anybody who was bored by the story they were watching knew they only had 15 minutes and they could stick with it and the next one would be better. And that's exactly what happened. That format was put on the air as not a salvation, but to fill airtime that Disney owned. And nobody expected it to be a huge success. And the fact that it was a huge success was the accident of demography. All of a sudden, people were having fewer and fewer kids. And as a result, the Disney audience started to descend. And what was the option? There was this interesting program called 60 Minutes. The big difference was the adults got to choose what they were watching, not the kids. And before the day that everybody had a TV set, or today a smartphone and a computer, in those days there was generally one TV set in the house. And if the kids commanded it, that's it. Nobody else had time to watch during that hour. Well, when the adults were making the decision, suddenly they were coming to 60 Minutes. And week by week, the 60 Minutes audience was growing, much to the amazement, surprise, and shock of CBS management, or the money part of the business, and CBS News itself, which never expected the program to be a big success. As a matter of fact, when Don Hewitt came to Dick Salant and proposed the program, Dick thought, I don't know if that's going to work, but what the heck, give it a try. So he wisely never took credit for it himself. It belonged to Don Hewitt. And here we are, whatever it is, going on 40 years later. It's still the most popular program that is now coming out of a news division, nowhere near the popularity that it had at its height, which is best described by this anecdote. For a period of 3 years in the 1970s, the audience for 60 Minutes was so large and the advertising rates were so high that more than 50% of the profit of CBS Incorporated, which then was only a broadcast company, that's all they had, broadcast, more than 50% of the profit came from that 1 hour of television once a week.
Wow.
Yes, wow is right. Oddly enough, that's never gotten that much publicity. But if you think that what is television, as Don Hewitt himself said, television is programming that separates the commercials. The commercials is what makes television. That's what makes the money and makes the programs and all that gone together. And the fact that one program once a week for 1 hour represented more than 50% of the profit of the entire network, I have never imagined anything as stunning as that from a corporate point of view.
Right. So I was a little boy during this period of time. I'm always fascinated by the idea that people say today, there's never been as many divisions in the United States as there are today, because while I was a little boy, I remember the 60s, and it seems to me like the divisions were just as great or greater during that period, maybe than any other time in American history other than the Civil War. But two things stand out to me during that period: the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And CBS played a major role in both. And what I'd like to know is, I look at the Civil Rights Movement, and I'm certainly a big supporter of it. I think that what happened was necessary to happen. What Johnson put forward in terms of bills and rule changes were necessary. But it seems to me that the media, the CBS, played a large role in helping move that forward as well. The things that you decided to cover, whether it was the March on Selma or a wide Martin Luther King or his speeches or those types of things. How did you make the decision as to what you were going to prioritize? Was it actually a cultural agenda, or did you just see it as news and you were responding to it?
Well, at first, of course, it was news, and it never lost that aspect. It was the biggest story of the time. It was the one I cut my teeth on when I first came to CBS News. There was no way of avoiding it. And who would want to avoid a story that was that big and covered so much of society? But beyond that, the cultural element of it, the recognition of it as being important as it was and still is in many aspects, that developed as we covered the story. There's an analogy, I guess, to the Vietnam War in a sense that more than half of the evening news during the period of the height of the civil rights movement were civil rights stories. There were times when the entire broadcast was nothing but when there were crises and when there were explosions. It was a story you had no way of avoiding, and the story that you needed to contextualize. And that was the real challenge. It's hard to be fair on a story like that, but you have to recognize that when people like George Wallace, governor of Alabama, came along and had a different view of the world and was followed by a serious percentage of citizens in the United States, you had to be able to deal with that as a news story as well as a cultural development. We're into the same thing now. The MAGA movement with former President Trump cannot be ignored, obviously. But the obviousness of that doesn't help us to understand what the cultural impact of it is. We're living through that period right now, trying to put Trump in some kind of a context beyond being an easy headline, and because of his style, he can say things that suddenly go viral. Well, things didn't go viral in those days, except in terms of people who watched the news. And people who watched the news came to the office the next day and discussed what was going on. That's what made 60 Minutes as popular as it was. It turned out a Sunday night program, if you hadn't seen it, you had nothing to say in the office on Monday morning, unless by accident there happened to be a big news event. But that doesn't happen every Sunday night. So that was an important aspect of making 60 Minutes popular. If you got into the office and you hadn't watched the program, everybody else was talking about it and you had nothing to say. So that a story that digs that deeply into a culture, whether it is what's going on your block and everybody else knows about it, but somehow you were out of town when it happened, you know what that's like. Well, you can translate that into a whole nation. And the civil rights movement was something you could in no way get away from. It was around you all the time, and you didn't have to live in the South. You didn't have to live anywhere in particular, not only to be aware of it, but to have an impact on your life. It simply did. And that had to be dealt with. And That's a very tough thing to do. Anybody who has dealt in daily journalism knows the challenge of contextualizing the story that they are covering. To them, it's the biggest deal of the day because it's their deal. They're responsible for reporting it. But you have to recognize that it has to fit into a society. And another subject is, this is, I think, one of the problems we're having now, is that stories can take on an apparent importance that isn't really true. But that's a subject for a whole nother program.
So on the Vietnam War, help me think about that. The Vietnam War, for I think a long period of time, there was a kind of fair coverage. It went back and forth, but then there's that moment where Walter Cronkite actually comes out, I believe, in opposition to the war itself. How do we view that? How do we view that from a news standpoint?
Wonderful example. Why? If you go back and read the, quote, editorial that Walter delivered after long, long thought, it's not very powerful. It is not, we've got to get out of this. It's not a personal opinion. What it is what I think the best editorials are, a collection of facts that lead to what you hope people would conclude logically. That's not easy to do when you're dealing with a war that was the example of the overwhelming story in the United States. We had been reporting, as reporters do, all the things that went wrong with that war. In one way, that wasn't hard to do. There were very few things that were going right. What was going right was what the establishment, the administration in Washington was putting out in its hopes of convincing people that this war was necessary, being successfully fought, and was the bulwark against the growth of communism in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. The facts were otherwise. They were on the ground. I was there. I was the bureau chief in Saigon, 67, 68. And it didn't take any reporter long to hit the ground in Vietnam and realize this was a war not only that the United States couldn't win, but was in effect losing, as it finally did. It went counter to the official version. It's hard to fight an official version because the official version gets a lot of space and a lot of time and deals with the balance in journalism. You cannot not tell the story that the government is avowing is truth. And all you can do is go out, get facts that fight that truth, and say, okay, you make up your mind. Which is the right, which is the wrong? And for those of us in Vietnam reporting, it was a frustration. The frustration was we felt we weren't getting through. Part of the problem was we were there, and what was going on in the United States was so far away from us, we had no contact with it. We didn't realize the level of pushback from students, from people who were joining the anti-war movement. We had no idea how big that was until we ourselves finally got back to the United States and saw what the results of our and everybody else's reporting was going on. So it's a disconnect between being on the scene, trying to do an honest job of reporting, which included balance. We dutifully went to what became known as the 5 o'clock follies in Saigon. At 5 o'clock every afternoon, the PR machine of the military went out and told you how many Viet Cong had been killed, what great advances we had made. Invariably, that was contradictory to what we were reporting on the air. We reported their numbers. We told the audiences what they said, but then we balanced that with what we knew to be true.
Right. So I'm going to flip the subject a little bit on you and give me a second to set this up. So in 1969, 1973, there's a period of time where we're doing the moonshot. On the moonshot, one of the things that I find to be interesting is that the networks covered that almost full time. I can remember as a little boy at 9 years old, I knew the name of all the astronauts, their spouses. I could tell you the names of some of the people who were engineers. I almost could recite for you what Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were saying as the communication was going back and forth between the module and the spacecraft. I remember sitting on, my grandmother had a concrete floor, and it was there was one television with rabbit ears at the end of it, and me and two of my buddies were laying on that cool concrete floor as we're sitting there watching it. And the moment that we sat down, I remember my grandmother cried, and my grandfather just kept saying, how amazing it was. It was one of those moments that the entire country pulled together, and to me, the media played a role in that. Whether they had to do it or not, I'm not sure, but they played a role because they made it such a priority. And then I watched today, we have these 3 billionaires that are on a race to go to Mars, which I think is a really cool thing. You've got these 3 groups spending tons of money. It's not public money. We've commercialized it, and we have these guys in this race to figure out who can get there first. And yet the president doesn't show up at it. The media seems to, like I watched William Shatner for about 30 seconds on Fox News and CNN when he went into space and came back down, and he was crying about how great of an event it was. But there was no takeoff. There was no countdown. There was no context that it was being filled in. Sometimes I have a sense that everything that we're hearing today seems to be negative. And that doesn't mean that you just gave us with the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, how there was coverage of negative things that were going on, but there was also a chance to celebrate the beautiful things that were happening in this country. Am I misreading that? Am I looking at that incorrectly?
No, you're not looking at it incorrectly, but it's complicated. A lot of us, some of us at CBS News, quietly among ourselves, thought Walter Cronkite made a mistake with the space program. He fell in love with that story. Understandable, the same way you are expressing your fascination with the idea of going to Mars. And because it was a national challenge presented to the country by the President of the United States, who gave us a 10-year deadline, we're going to the moon, and we did that. The idea of going counter to that idea was difficult, if not impossible. Why was it difficult? Something we now know, that the time when Kennedy presented that challenge, the people who were holding their heads and saying, "Oh my God," were the people who knew better. They said, "We can't do that in 10 years." But it was a political goal that had been set, and political goals have to be met. And this remarkable country proved that it can put talent together that can accomplish the impossible. I guess the example I can give you is this, that if you have a high-end smartphone in your pocket, you have more computing power in your pocket than the United States had in its computers to go to the moon. Stop and think about that for a minute. It used to be
amazing.
true of our simplest computers. A Chrome computer, in many ways, has a lot more power than we had going to the moon. But we managed to pull it off. So that in the end, that's also the responsibility of journalism. There was nobody around to question seriously, but some people did, but it wasn't a serious level of questioning of, can we do this? Number one. Two, should we do this? What are we not doing by doing this? Those are usually, and quite naturally, questions that come up after the fact. And I think that's, for instance, what I think we are now doing with the trip to Mars. But people have smartened up. I think they realize, well, eventually we'll get to Mars. Somebody will get to Mars. Preferably it'll be us. But that's a long time off. And the likelihood is I'm not going to be around. So you tend to lose interest in things that are going to happen after you're gone. True for my generation. I'm not as interested in stories about a 20-year horizon, 30-year horizon than I am in what's going to happen in the next month or two or year or two, that kind of thing. So that plays a role in how and what you report. But the complexity keeps coming back to the fact that we're living in a totally different news universe. We're dealing in a different technological universe. We haven't even mentioned a little thing called AI, which is going to change all of our worlds totally, and we're not in any sense sure of how. We're learning as we go, yada, yada, yada. Those are all life-changing, cultural changing, political changing challenges that are sitting right here with us, right next to us.
All right. So, Peter, you have called currently, I believe, that we are in the golden age of journalism now. Now, that is amazing. When I just think of this story that you just gave us about the Vietnam War,
nobody agrees with
what happened in the
way.
civil rights movement, what was happening with CBS. I mean, it's unbelievable the role that CBS played in our life. But yet you say the golden age is the one that's here. Help me understand that. Explain that to me.
Well, first of all, the CBS News, the golden age that I was lucky enough to be a part of, was simpler to explain. There were only 3 networks, 2.5 really, and then ABC reached parity. So 3 networks, that was it. You had your newspapers, your favorite newspaper, if you read a newspaper that you had available to you, and radio was fading already at the time. It's turning to music, not news. It's a very small universe, very tight little universe. Now, with the advent of satellites, with the advent of the internet, with the advent as a result of those technologies of news moving 24/7 and having no period to stop and think, you just move from one event to another. They come rushing over you, through you, and a week later you may have already forgotten them. That is a very, very different universe. And the reason I call it a golden universe is this. It's a challenge that I realize is almost impossible for most people to meet. In the old days, we watched what we watched, we read what we watched, we listened to what we listened to, based on our trust of the medium or the individuals that we listened to, read about, and so forth. We put our trust in the editors who were making the choices of the news that was being delivered to us. That system now sits on its head. The amount of information, sources, everything that a journalist has to work with in the old days was extremely limited. It was a lot by the standards of the people who were reading or listening to the news media, but it was very limited in terms of what was going on in the world. We are now living in an opposite time. All of us, each of us who have that smartphone sitting in our pocket, have a computer, have access to the internet, which is why the internet is so important, have access not only to what every editor in the world has access to, but more, much more. There isn't anything that goes on in the world that doesn't find its way at least onto the internet. The trick is obviously finding it. And this is why, by the way, where AI is going to come into play. So far, it's been a manual operation. And the manual operation that I recommend to people is find sources of news that are available to you that you think are worthy of your trust. Read them in the time you have available, and in effect, make up your own newscast. Stay on top of the news as much as you have an interest, or you feel responsible for, or you feel a duty to do. And that's particularly applicable, for instance, if you have kids and things that may affect their lives. These are things you can know about and you should know about. And you have the information available, but you have to find it as an individual. That's why search engines are so important, pardon me. And they are, as we are now discovering, of limited use. Anybody who has used AI in any form as a search now realizes how embryonic Google and Bing and so forth are. They're good, but they're babies compared to where we are headed. We are headed into an era where we are going to have access to information in an organized fashion, where we can ask any question we want and get an instant viable answer from many, many different sources. If you're somebody who is a true blue MAGA person, you're not going to change. You need the kind of information that makes you feel good. That's your choice. If you're at the opposite end, if you're not only if you're, the people that are described as, heaven forbid, socialists, you can make that choice too. You can limit your input to what makes you convinced of your own feelings, opinions, and so forth and so on. But my answer is to anybody who has an honest interest in the world and wants to deal with it in an organized fashion, we are moving into the golden age of information.
I think that's true. And what I want to talk about in this next or in this last segment is, how do you get to the truth? And I think I am more interested in people who are independent minded. If you're looking for dogma, if you're looking for orthodoxy, you're on the right or the left, that's what you're looking for. As you said, it's easy to find. You can just tune into the 4 or 5 different things on your side. You can figure it out. But for those people who are more in a search for truth and who are willing to recognize, I don't have the corner on truth. I can still learn from other people. I can learn sometimes from the MAGA side, from the left side. I can learn from people who are in the middle. Finding that truth becomes more difficult. So my view has been, and again, I'm interested in your view on this, but one of the things I think has been an advantage are podcasts. Now, podcasts are advantage because instead of having to trust in Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity to figure out what are the 3 questions that you're going to ask a candidate, which by itself is framing the candidate in one form or another.
Exactly.
I could go listen to them for an hour or 2 and understand kind of where they're coming from on a wide variety of issues and have a better understanding. At the same time, if you're going to my podcast, or for that matter, anybody's podcast, to find facts and truth, good luck. That we're not really digging through trying to figure out, is something a fact? Are we validating our sources? Are we making certain that there's at least 2 different sources that are confirming it? So there you have to find more independent moderators. And I tend to trust newspapers on that. And I'll read the left and the right. I'll look at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and try to understand where both may be coming from and where they may present it differently. But to me, they're more bought into facts than podcasts are. But if you want to get to the truth, you kind of need both, because I want the long form version of what I'm going to hear from a candidate, But whatever those facts are that maybe the podcaster's not giving because they actually had to work really hard to get that person as a guest onto their show, they're certainly not going to try to push them into a corner to try to understand an inconsistency that may exist in one of their positions. I'm going to look more to newspapers. But my question to you is on that whole thing. You're right. We have more information. Everybody, anybody can be a journalist. We all can have an effect on helping get the news out, and we can get information from a variety of sources. But how do we also ensure that we're trying to figure out what that truth really is, the truth that exists in society?
Well, there's maybe an oversimplified one-word answer. It's called education. And education, to me, is where all this has to begin. And education at all levels, not only in the school systems, but also in homes. Having now lived in recent times through an era where very often both parents were working, the ability of a parent or both parents to spend time at their piece of the education of children has not only weakened, but disappeared in many cases. So what substitutes for it? Well, anybody with kids, I challenge them to ask a question of their school system. Is critical thinking taught to your kids? And if so, when? At what age? Because what you're describing is critical thinking, is the ability to bring to life the important questions you need to ask. Sometimes that question is, as you said, listening to the other side and finding out even more from the other side than you do from your own. You know your own side. You don't know the other side. Find out from them. We have an education system that at one end, at the high end, is the best in the world. All very easy to see. The world comes to us for higher education. At the lower end, we have, and this is a whole nother subject, we have 50 states who determine their education systems. That leaves us with a hierarchy that goes from the worst to the best. And the gap between the two is frightening, absolutely frightening. We have a lot of problems in between. We have very good school systems that can't do their job because they are badly funded, because of bad systems of funding. We have school systems that have more recently been taken over by ideologies. That's got no business in any kind of a school system. That goes right back to critical thinking. You have to be able to teach anything that is of any importance. And what gets lost in all this? What you said, facts. Try to define a fact. Try to define randomly 5 people, not who are all agreed, but 5 people who have different points of view, and have a discussion about what's a fact to you? What's a fact to you? What's a fact to you? It'll make for an interesting conversation. The likelihood is it will not come up with an answer, because I don't think there are answers to that. But obviously, one person's fact is another person's opinion. We've all had that experience. So that defining these things is not the answer. The answer is building a platform of knowledge, and that is education, that is going to give us the ability to think critically, the ability to come at all these subjects. If I can give an example of where I think it works better, it's in many of the European systems, which are national systems, national education systems, and have core requirements of everybody. They're a lot tougher than ours. More subjects, more deeply gone into, more time in school, more time in homework, so forth and so on. So that you have a basis, which becomes a cultural basis too, of a society that then has a platform from which it can work effectively from an intellectual point of view. that's a dream, and it works for them. It can't work for us given the system that we have. So we have to find other ways of doing it. And I suppose one way, if you look at it from the way we operate, what happens if we had a leadership, a president, prominent people who are setting the standards here and not in the muck of political ideologies? What if we had a Jack Kennedy who, in this day and age, instead of going to the moon, decided a higher level of education in the United States was a goal that we had to meet and gave us a deadline to meet that? Those are the kinds of things that help.
And I think one of the disappointments with me with several of the past administrations, not that I don't believe that we shouldn't have focused on healthcare and other issues, but I think if we would have put that same focus on education, we not only would have had a better way to unify the country, we also would have helped those people at the lowest economic rung. And I love what you're saying, because there is a vast difference between wisdom and ideology. They're completely different. Ideology tends to be about not only coming up with some worldview, but then having some group that you're pointing to that caused you the problem. And so once you can say, well, that's the group that caused me the problem, you can begin to objectify them. And once you can begin to objectify them, you can dehumanize them. And then you transfer. All of us have good and evil inside of us. We all have the propensity to do bad things or good things. We know that. But once you get into an ideology, you shift that and you say, well, our side's good, their side's evil. And then even at the lowest level, you have an inability to work together. Whereas wisdom's built upon this basis of first you have data, and then you build knowledge, and then you gain understanding, and then you can get to wisdom. But you have to have a set of data points that matter first, that help you build that wisdom. And you also have to have a constant understanding of the need to be able to change.
Absolutely.
So for people who are doing podcasting, people who are now the more democratic journalists that you're talking about, what's your advice to them? Your advice to them as they're trying to do their thing in podcasting, recognizing they're in many ways a much more democratic and a much more robust group of journalists than maybe we even have in the paid media today?
Well, there's no advice I can give that is across the board, because like everything else, podcasts vary from atrocious to brilliant and everything in between. In a sense, that's the strength, and in a sense, that's the challenge, because unfortunately now we're at a time where we are so divided, so bifurcated, that anything you want to buck up your own point of view, your own arguments, you can find it, not only in a single podcast, but probably a whole set of podcasts. And that's exactly what's happening. People, by and large, tune to the podcasts that they like, not because they challenge them, but because they find agreement, they find support for their arguments, they find something that gives them comfort. The trick is to be uncomfortable. Are you going to get an audience from that? I doubt it. And in the end, somebody has to pay for all this, and the people who are paying are not going to pay for small audiences. They're going to pay for the people who make the loudest and the biggest noises. That doesn't accomplish much. So that I have no great bit of advice. I do have some statistics that I hope will get people thinking more along these lines. And I'll start by asking you, you know what illiteracy is, right?
Yes.
Do you know what functional illiteracy is?
I'm not certain I would be able to know what the definition is to that.
Functional illiteracy is being able to read and write, but not understand what you're reading and write. The simplest example is a manual. Remember the days when there were manuals to teach you how to do something? You could read the manual, but you didn't know how to use it. If you combine functional illiteracy and total illiteracy in the United States, what percentage of the population do you think that represents?
Oh, I would guess it's over 50%.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the number.
I would guess it's over 50%. You combine the two.
No, God forbid. If it goes that high, we're in even worse trouble than I think we are. It's somewhere between 30 and 40. It's a difficult figure to get a hold.
What percent is would you consider to be illiterate, and what it was the functional illiteracy that I gave a larger number to? How do you assign the numbers to both?
That's the reason there is a 10% gap between the various surveys that are done and tests that are given, because they vary all over the lot. But the fact is that as high as 40% of the American population is in one form or another illiterate. Well, if you don't tackle that problem, you're not going to get anywhere. It's that simple. I really believe that. I think because I give you a comparison. Look at the rest of the world. They're in the 90s. Cuban literacy is 98%. The European Union as a whole, 95 to 98%. China is in the mid-90s. There is no country on earth that is as challenged in its literacy as the United States. And we are the richest, the strongest, however you want to describe it, country in the world. But we're on our knees.
All right. So help me bring this to a closing, and it's going to be around this question. Everything that you're bringing up, I find, while I am an optimist, I believe that pessimism plays an incredibly important role in the United States, because what happens is, I love this line from the Chinese economist who said, well, the thing that I like about the Chinese economy is that we're the biggest and the strongest and we're doing the best things. He says, and the thing I like about the United States economy is that when it's not going well, you can say so. Right. I mean, there's the idea that we have people who can point out problems has an advantage because they point them out and then we have to go work on them. And so, and again, if I were giving a single issue that I were to pick at the top of the list, it would be education as well, overwhelmingly. In fact, if you want to know a good reason to do a podcast, it's not to get great numbers. It's to learn. I have learned more from my guests in listening to them and trying to understand them. And then, of course, I spent 4 hours reading about you before you came on. And I learned about so many things about your life, and that enriches my life. I don't know what it does for my audience, but I know it makes my life better. I enjoy being able to do that. Here's my question. You've had this amazing seat watching American history. I mean, just an amazing seat. We just covered your parents moved from Germany. The Holocaust was taking place. You came here and you built a life in a television station in Alaska, and then went to CBS and worked along other giants. And I count you as one of the giants in American journalism as well. And you saw what happened in the Vietnam War and with the Kennedy assassination and the moonshot, all these things. And now we're talking about another challenge, all right? The challenge of illiteracy and the challenge of facts and a media that's becoming echo chambers where people aren't really learning things from other groups, are just paying attention to the things that they want to. Does all of this, when you get done, leave you in a position where you're still optimistic about the United States, or do you have a pessimistic view of who we are and where we're going?
I'm optimistic to my core, not only with the United States, but point me at the worst situation in the world and I will find you a place. And here's the important word. It's a word, interestingly enough, that Kamala Harris has started using: hope. If you lose hope, forget it. It's all over. But if you can maintain hope, and there are many, many ways, and we've discussed many of them, of having hope, seeing that either, oh, this has happened before and we lived through it, or I can see a way out of this, or I have to be able to find a way out of this. All of those things are part of hope. If you have hope, you can remain an optimist, even in the worst situation.
You know, Ronald Reagan, I had a dinner with Ronald Reagan and also Pierre Salinger, and it was a fascinating dinner. He was here to give a speech, but we ended up in this private setting. And that was his comment. He made this comment. I said, so what advice would you give me as mayor? And he said, look, there's lots of problems going on, but the single most important thing that you have to remember is leave people with hope. They're going to hear pessimism from lots of different sources. Your job as a leader is to leave them believing that they can do better. Now, here's the fascinating comment. He leaves, and Pierre Salinger, who of course was a speechwriter for John F. Kennedy, said, oh my gosh, he and John Kennedy are exactly alike. I said, what? What do you mean John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan are exactly alike, right? And I went to the Kennedy school, and I was like, I don't get that. He said, look, these are two people who have a very optimistic view about who we are. They just have a different way of solving the problem.
Right. Exactly.
And I thought that was a beautiful way to see both of them.
Yeah. However you can find it, find your hope.
Yep. Well, Peter, I can't tell you how much not only I enjoyed having you on our show, but I just want to say this. You are a wonderful American. I am so glad you've been a part of this country's history. I'd like to thank you for all the great work that you've done and tip my hat to you. Thank you very much, Peter.
That's very kind. I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.